making decisions is becoming more and more the central activity that you're going to participate in as a software engineer. And in today's episode, I want to talk to you about advanced techniques in decision making and in persuasion. We're not going to cover the whole gamut here. We're going to talk about a couple of them to hopefully get your wheels turning about this topic, about the fact that your job will continue to move more and more towards critical decision making, and you're not always going to have direct control over that. My name is Jonathan Cottrell. My goal on the show is to help driven developers like you find clarity, perspective, and purpose in their careers. And we're talking a lot about change recently. We're talking about how these new agentic tools are changing our jobs every day. And the primary impact that this has had, we're going to try to sum up a lot of what's happening in the industry right now in a very short summary here, but the primary impact this is having is it's making coding a lot cheaper, right? You may disagree with this. We can talk, more about why I believe this is the case, but overall, a lot of things that otherwise would have taken more time are accomplishable. Now, notice I'm not saying optimally accomplishable. I'm not saying that what's delivered by these agentic workflows is perfect by any means, but the outcomes that that AI tooling, that agentic workflows are producing are sufficient enough that they are shortening the lead time, right? They're shortening the cycles required to accomplish a given thing. And so as a part of that, engineers and software development lifecycle people who control the SDLC in a company, they're recognizing that this is changing where the bottlenecks are. It's changing, what this job really is about, right? It produces a much faster step in the process. And interestingly, that faster step in the process used to be usually the bottleneck, right? So we didn't incrementally improve the bottleneck. These tooling improvements are drastically changing that bottleneck so that other things now are much, much more the bottleneck. And so if you know much about this language that I'm using when I say bottleneck, it comes mostly from traditional manufacturing where, let's say you make widgets, and in your widget factory, you have a series of steps, and each step takes a certain amount of time. Maybe it takes, it has a certain failure rate, it has a certain throughput, it has, required upstream components that need to be taken into account. But ultimately, in this environment, this kind of traditional manufacturing environment, your total throughput at the end of that pipe is essentially defined, right? The velocity of your factory is defined by the bottleneck. And so, if you were to go and get your Six Sigma black belt, or if you have an MBA and you work in a traditional manufacturing environment, that the prescription is to work on your bottleneck until it's no longer the bottleneck, but then don't keep working on that area. Divert your resources to the new bottlenecks, right? Start moving people, start moving money, start moving, resources, whatever resources you have, towards the new emerging bottleneck. Of course, you can't regress on the solved bottleneck that you just left. You have to make sure that stays solved. Arguably, coding is not totally solved, right? We still have problems of quality, control, review, all of these things that start to emerge. But because this bottleneck picture is changing, we can disagree on how much and how thorough that change is, but it is changing. Because of that, we're starting to see those resources divert, right? There's some intuitive response to this, which is, well, if this particular step is super, super fast, then we don't want people sitting idle. What can happen in this picture is you have, if nothing else changes, right? If nothing else about our pipeline changes, then engineers are going to be sitting around waiting on work to arrive, right? The typical product backlog is they're not overworked to the point where they have a ton of stock. This is, again, those manufacturing terms. In a typical factory setting, you would call this a stock, where you have, let's say, a bunch of those widgets. They're halfway done and they arrive at the bottleneck step. Well, if the upstream steps are really fast, and if there's too many resources already dedicated to those upstream steps, right, the parts that make the first half of the widget, and there's going to be a big pile of half-made widgets sitting in front of the bottleneck, right? The stuff kind of piles up before the bottleneck. And so if we were to see that, product had a big backlog that is piling up faster than the engineers can burn through it, then the effect here that I'm talking about will be a little bit delayed, right? Because engineers are going to work through that backlog as quickly as they can, which now is much faster. But once they get to the point where that backlog has been burned through, now we're talking about a new kind of a novel experience for most engineering teams, where the engineers are outpacing their upstream counterparts. All right. So this is why in this episode, we're going to focus on some of the upstream things that are not far away from engineering, even some of the in-process engineering things that have traditionally not been in your job description as an engineer, right? That most of the time, these, what we're talking about today with decision-making, has not necessarily fallen into your lap. You can defer, or you can delegate those decisions out. They're not necessarily your job. In a lot of kind of Scrum type environments, a product owner or a project manager, all of these terms for people who handle those decisions. Maybe a designer is handling them. Maybe it's a business representative. Whatever that is, most of the time engineers have been responsible for the how, not necessarily the what. But it's very likely that as this bottleneck of how gets smaller, your responsibilities as an engineer to continue moving resources to the bottleneck, right? The responsibilities you're going to have is to help make more decisions, help facilitate decision making, so that we're making faster decisions, and the throughput of these other processes can start to equalize with the throughput of the how, the actual coding, throughput that you are. Hopefully, at this point, that this is changing, and that if you are not paying attention to those changes, that you're going to get left behind. Okay. So we want to talk about decision making. We want to talk about specifically a couple of aspects of decision making that I've seen these two things kind of get in the way of a lot of otherwise very senior engineers who have great careers, who are really good at what they do, but they get stuck in these two things. I want to talk about two of them today. But first, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Unblocked. Your coding agents have access to your code base and probably much more. And you've probably connected all of the MCPs that your organization has access to, but it's not easy to keep up with all of that. And access doesn't always just equate to context. Agents can't really reason across MCPs. They don't know what architectural decisions you've made, for example. They don't know your team's patterns. Why is the API shaped the way that it is? So agents are looking in the wrong place, and then they can often deliver bad outputs as a result of that. This is part of what I was talking about. Coding is not totally solved. We still have some of these kinds of problems. So then you spend your time correcting what the agent did, which is wasting your time and your tokens just to get back to a baseline. Unblocked is the context layer that your agents are missing. It synthesizes your PRs, your docs, your Slack messages, Jira issues into organizational context that agents actually understand. So they make better plans, they write higher quality code, and they'll use fewer tokens in the process, requiring fewer correction loops. If you're running Claude Code, Cursor, or any other agentic workflow, which if you're not by now, then it's time to get on board, Unblocked is worth a look. Get a free 3-week trial at getunblocked.com/developer-t. That's getunblocked.com/developer-t. Thanks again to Unblocked for sponsoring today's episode of Developer T. So we're going to talk about two ways that I have seen, a large number, I don't know exactly how many, of senior engineers get tripped up on these two things, these two aspects of decision-making. And I want to be clear, when I say decision-making here, I don't just mean making the final call. Decision-making in an organizational context, in a product context, is very much about creating arguments for what you think should happen. This is more like a debate than it is about authority and making the final call. And so it is much less, on your shoulders to make a good decision. And it's much more about how do you bring to light the correct information, the correct arguments to persuade and help create the right conditions for good decision making. Right? So because engineers are being relied on more for decisions, and very largely speaking, engineers have not been involved in these discussions in the past, these areas are easy to trip on, right? The first area that I want to talk about is decisions that you don't need to make. Now, I know we just now talked about how this is all about, persuading and getting involved and raising the right context, etc. But decision-making, especially persuasive, collective, or collaborative decision-making for engineers, this is very much an art and provides an opportunity for you to work in a way that you haven't before, or work in a way that you are not required to as often or weren't required to as often as an engineer. And a lot of times this is a social responsibility. And so in other words, as you're making decisions with a group of people, your track record and your decision-making behaviors, your communication behaviors, all of these things matter to whatever the current atomic decision is that you're trying to make today, right? So what does that mean? It means that whatever you did in the past and whatever you did in the last decision that you made together, whatever attitude you took towards other people's opinions, all of this matters for your credibility in making decisions going forward. So this is very important because an important aspect of this social environment that you're going to be participating in is making sure that you are excuse me, is making sure that you're not using too much of your capital, your social capital in this case, right? In other words, if you're constantly putting your reputation on the line, for example, saying, you can trust me on this. If not, then if I'm wrong about this, then you can hold me accountable to that. That's essentially what you're saying when you put forth an argument. In most cases, you're saying, this is what I believe, and if I'm wrong, then in the future, you should trust me less, right? In the future, if I'm wrong about this, then, and if I continue to be wrong, if I get a track record of being wrong, then it makes sense, it makes logical sense, it makes intuitive sense for other people to stop trusting you with decision making. And so a lot of times what we'll do is we'll spend our capital, it's not literal capital, it's social capital. We'll spend that on decisions that matter the most to us. So in other words, the advice here is avoid spending your capital, avoid putting your opinion out onto the table for things that matter very little to you. So there's a couple of ways to think about this. One is to recognize that often we as humans, and especially as engineers, we feel the need or the kind of intellectual itch to scratch when someone presents an argument that we disagree with. And so it's very possible for us to disagree with that argument. And because of that, because we are prone to see an argument as an opportunity to set our own argument out, we get involved in that discussion. Now, sometimes we do this because we actually care about the outcome. Other times we do it without really even caring about the outcome. It's very important to delineate between what outcomes am I actually going to care about here, right? The opinion that I have where I think you're wrong about this. Can I think that someone is wrong and simultaneously not offer my own opinion? The correct kind of approach to this, in my opinion here, is to avoid getting involved in arguments and decisions that you don't care about the outcome for. Generally speaking, avoid getting into that. This is an exercise in self-control, because if you do have a differing opinion, it is often difficult to withhold it. But as we'll talk about for the second critical mistake, it's important to recognize what the utility of your opinion is. In this case, the utility of sharing your opinion is for your own kind of self-satisfaction. The utility of sharing your opinion is not in order to change the decision, because you don't actually care about that, right? To you, the utility of sharing your opinion in this environment is to feel better, right? To feel intellectually engaged in the discussion. And this is usually not worth the risk that you're taking. The risk that you're taking, of course, is once again putting your reputation on the line, potentially burning others' trust in you. Of course, anytime you are in confrontation with another person, you're challenging somebody else. If they cared a lot about that outcome and then they didn't get what they wanted, then they may develop a kind of contrary or contrarian relationship with you, right? So it matters because in the future, you are going to care about something, right? You are going, and maybe they won't care about that thing, but because they have a contrarian opinion to you or they don't trust you anymore, the thing that you do care about, the thing that you have a lot of knowledge on, the thing that maybe, the utility of your opinion is actually you want this to change, they might fight you on it. They may come into the room and disagree with you on it because they think that anything that comes out of your mouth is ultimately worth disagreeing with. Now, these are very extreme examples. Most of the time, this happens in much more subtle ways, but most of your opportunities are about picking your battles here, right? There's another kind of variant on this piece of advice, which is to recognize what decisions will make themselves. Okay, so in other words, and this is actually a really common example. If you find yourself trying to convince someone else of a future you believe will happen if a decision is made, okay? You're trying to convince them that if we do X, then Y is going to happen. A good example of this is if we change our hiring policies in this particular way, we're going to remove an interview. We're going to add an interview, right? We're going to change the, who's allowed to interview. We're going to change what our first call looks like. We're going to change how we do our, technical evaluation. All of these are adjustments to the interviewing process. So let's say your manager says, "Oh, we're going to change that." The outcome that you may predict as an engineer, you may say, "Oh, I really hate that. If I was a candidate, I would stop. I would stop my candidacy." So I need to tell somebody that, I predict this future could happen, that other people are going to stop. The utility of your opinion here, okay, is matched by simply quietly waiting. In other words, the adjustment that they're wanting to make, if your hypothesis is correct that people are going to leave the pipeline because of these adjustments, that eventuality is going to happen even without your intervention. So the learning that you are hoping that somebody takes away from this, you can get for free by being patient and waiting. Now, I say free, there is an asterisk next to this, which is there's downside potentially to those negative effects. So, for example, you may have a delay in your pipeline. If you actually care about the hiring process, succeeding or failing, for most engineers, your kind of core responsibilities are not necessarily to improve the hiring pipeline. That's a hiring manager's job. It's part of the leadership's job. And so if you're getting involved in these decision-making processes and trying to provide feedback in order to improve the hiring process, it's very possible for you to kind of take the watchful waiting approach. Let's see what happens. Because now you're not putting yourself in a position where, maybe you're wrong, right? And so now you kind of sounded the alarm, or you gave feedback that ultimately ended up being wrong. We get back into that kind of erosion of your credibility if you keep doing this. And so when you're sharing your opinions, remember that the core piece of advice here is sharing your opinion is not a free action, right? Sharing your opinion about a decision that's being made is a transaction. You're making a transaction by saying, please consider what I'm saying as an input to your decision-making process, but also here's my opinion, and you can come back and update your beliefs about me based on whether my opinion pans out to be true or not, right? So I want to be clear, because I think, as I'm talking through this, I'm recognizing that we're talking about kind of a political management, right? That you'd have to engage in. And that's actually true. That's a true part of this transition. And one of the hard parts of this transition for a lot of engineers is going to be that your job responsibilities, which used to be a little bit more kind of concrete and easily kind of defined as a hard science kind of definition, where something works or it doesn't work. A lot of software engineering jobs are going to shift more and more towards those soft skill kind of things, right? And decision making certainly fits in this category. So I think it's important to recognize that as we're talking about decision making, that decision making in a collective, collaborative environment is not the same thing. It's not the same thing as making a good technical decision, right? If you are arguing, if two engineers are arguing about the merits of one technical solution versus another, then based on some specific criteria, right, you could gather evidence that says one or the other of them is correct, right? And you could go through the process of choosing, a particular direction. Now, we all know that even in technical decisions, opinions abound. We have a lot of people who disagree about which direction is better, which language is more maintainable, or which thing is better for startups to use, or whatever. This is all a different kind of argumentation than what we're talking about with these other kind of, like, for example, product level decisions. Okay. The second trap. So the first trap, just to kind of recap this, the first trap is allowing your opinion to be your difference in opinion to be the reason that you get involved in an argument, right? Because you have an opinion, that is enough for you to jump in. And my suggestion is to recognize or pay closer attention to the utility of that action. Why? What exactly is the upside for you to get involved? Do you feel like it's going to benefit you from a social perspective, or like a reputational perspective? Is it going to benefit? Do you care very much about the outcome that you have an opinion about? Those are the ways that your opinion could have utility, or sharing your opinion could have utility in a given argument, in a given debate. The other trap the other trap that I see a lot of engineers falling into is when they do share an opinion or when they do share an argument, they're arguing from a position that is misaligned with the decision maker's motivations, right? So some classic examples of this might be a product manager asking a group of engineers to delay some optimization work in order to get some product features out the door. And a software engineer may come back with the argument that, well, if we do that, then our endpoints are going to be a little bit slower, or we're going to have to come back to that in a couple of months, and we're going to have to deal with the on-call between now and then. Well, if you're a product manager, these things you may be able to observe and recognize that they're true, but a product manager, they're unlikely to be motivated by reducing the on-call load for their engineers, because most of the time they can, maybe they have a system where that on-call load, is essentially like handled by one engineer, for example, right? And so that's not a compelling argument, right? And there's other examples where, okay, I really didn't, I don't personally like this kind of interview, so I don't want the company to use that kind of interview because I don't like it. I don't think it's a good interview. I think it's, I'm not very good at that kind of interview. Well, of course, if you are making the decision about what kind of interview you should incorporate in your recruitment processes, then one engineer telling you that they don't like that kind of interview may be a small data point on your overall radar, but it's not the most compelling case, right? A more compelling case, if you're that engineer, if you say, okay, this interview that we're introducing, this kind of interview is something that turns me off as an engineer, and I bet other engineers are like this. Let me go and find out whether that's true, if there's external data, right? And so your core argument is that you think this is bad. It goes against your personal values, but that argument may not align well with the decision maker's motivation. For example, let's say that your organization is introducing a systems design interview, and in your experience, maybe you haven't had a good experience with these systems design interviews. You think they're implemented poorly, or maybe that you just don't think they're very good at illuminating important skills, right? That may be your take on this. Which, by the way, I actually am a fan of systems design interviews. So this is a totally made up example, okay? Well, let's say that you don't like that, and you think it's a bad interview type. We should do something else. Maybe we should do another coding interview, a working session type interview. So you present this argument to your manager, and you say, I think this is a bad interview. And your manager says, well, why is that? And you may come back and say, well, because I'm not very good at this, I probably would I would remove my name from the list. I wouldn't want to work at the company, or I wouldn't want to go through the process of, going through that interview knowing that I was going to fail. It's anxiety inducing for me. And so your boss, your manager may come back to you and say, well, I understand that you're not good at these, but we have a completely different reason for wanting to run them. We want to recruit engineers who thoroughly understand systems design and have worked at companies that put a focus on that. So now the entire basis for your argument is essentially irrelevant to the decision, right? And so I see this happen all the time with engineers, where they're arguing from a position that they believe is rational. And this is a very important factor for you to consider in any decision-making situation, and really in other parts of life as well. This idea of what's called naive realism, that might be a term you would use for this. Naive realism, the idea that you somehow see the real world. You understand how things really are, right? That you have an unbiased take, or that you have a balanced take, or that something about your perspective is the closest to true that exists. and that anyone who kind of disagrees with you must be biased, must be wrong, must not have the information that you have. Nobody who makes good decisions would disagree with your perspective. And this, of course, is flawed. I mean, when we lay it out like that, hopefully you recognize that, well, I don't actually believe that. But we act in ways, our intuition informs us that we are that way, right? That we do have the best view. And thus, any disagreement, we often lack curiosity about whether we could be wrong. Our first instinct response is that other person is wrong. And now what do we do about that, right? What do I do about the fact that the other person's wrong? And so if I have a strong opinion that this is a bad interview type, that systems design is a bad interview type, and all I have to do is explain what, myself, and then that other person should jump on board with this, we may be missing an entire, functional reason for this decision that has nothing to do with our reasons for believing a particular way. All right, so the important factor here is alignment. This is the key term maybe for the rest of your career. If you can only learn, about one concept, it would be alignment. Because once you recognize what that other person cares about, two things really could probably happen. Either one, you recognize, oh, wait a second, if they don't care about this thing that I care about, but they do care about X, well, this does solve for that. Their decision is not unreasonable, right? Their decision actually totally fine. And my motivated reasoning, or my idea behind, why I didn't like this direction, has no bearing on what they're trying to optimize for. And so they should totally do whatever it is that they said they were going to do. So that's one potential outcome. Another potential outcome is you recognize that, wait a second, there's something else I could argue on here. I could take that approach that I was talking about earlier, where I identify that my feelings about this interview type are not just my personal feelings, that this is a growing sentiment among that group of engineers that maybe they're trying to recruit, that there is, a large faction of people think this is not a good interview. And then you have a different basis for your argument, right? You're trying to find something that the other person actually does care about. And so now, another great example of this is two engineers who have opinions about how a particular stack should be built. And one of them is optimizing for accessibility. How can we connect this thing, to our existing stack? And the other one's only optimizing for performance. And they're going to talk past each other unless they can recognize that their arguments are just misaligned, that they're going to argue on completely different axes, right? And so now, once you have both arguments in hand, and you have the optimization strategies of both of these, and you say, okay, what is it exactly that you're trying to accomplish with this decision, and why? Now you could say, okay, we have two totally different competing evaluations or criteria for the decision in the first place, right? So this is the piece of advice I have walking away from this for you is understand the criteria for the decision. Don't assume that your personal criteria generalizes to everyone else around you. There's a major, major mistake. Your opinion, your perspective, your worldview, your biases, and all of these other things are yours uniquely. And so if you try to generalize all of that stuff out, if you try to say, well, everybody has the same belief about X, or this is a common belief about Y, or we all agree on Z, then you're very likely to make mistakes. You're very likely to make arguments that nobody actually cares about except for you. Or if they do care about it, they care about it for a different reason or not as much as you do. You see, there's overlap between this and the first kind of trip up. The first trip up being, don't make arguments for things that you don't care about, right? And so the kind of the overarching theme of all of this is actually knowing what the other person is trying to accomplish and why. Decision making, especially in that collaborative environment, is largely about understanding what other people's motivations are and finding alignment, figuring out how can the thing that I want and the thing that you want be accomplished. How can we make a decision that works on the optimizations that you care about and the ones that I care about? This is the path to finding kind of a middle ground. It's interesting that decision making really is largely about negotiation. There's very similar recommendations for negotiation, which is recognizing that you can optimize for two different things, that it's not a zero-sum game. Ultimately, if you take nothing away from this episode other than this would be my one takeaway for you here, is to understand what the other person wants to do. What is it that they want? What do they care about? Why do they care about it? That is going to pay you back every time, over and over. And this is going to become a more and more important part of your job. It is just as wild to me that I'm sitting here talking about making better decisions together, or managing your political kind of relationships within your organization. We've talked a little bit about that in the past, but we could always kind of come back to, engineering as a core skill, but this is going to become more and more important. This always was becoming more important for you as you become more senior in your career, but the acceleration of your participation in decision making is going to be much faster now. And so it makes sense to start practicing this. It makes sense to start paying attention to this more and more. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Developer Tea. Hopefully this was an engaging discussion, an engaging way of thinking about decision making and about persuasion in decision making, how to make better decisions with your coworkers. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review in whatever podcasting app you currently use. Make sure you subscribe in YouTube or in that podcasting app as well. These are the best ways to make sure that this show sticks around. We're continuing with the show until I can't anymore. Honestly, I have no reason to stop doing Developer Tea. And it's been some of the most rewarding time that I spend on a weekly basis is thinking about these things and trying to engage with, what does this career have in store for you, for me, as we move forward into the new landscape that we're all staring in the face right now. And I'm excited for it, and I hope you are too. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, enjoy your tea.